And it has begun.
It has begun, so we don't get a little signal. So I just want to welcome everyone who's on this webinar. Sorry if you had some technical difficulties at the start. Not quite sure what happened there, but kudos to all of you who caught that last email. Just want to welcome you to this webinar today, which is being hosted by Mission+Strategy Consulting. My name is Jean Butson, and I am the president of Mission+Strategy. This is our second in a series of webinars on the topic of potential public policy changes that might be in store for our nation with the Trump presidential administration. We particularly wanted to focus in on the risks from changes to executive orders and policies that are the purview of the office of the president that could impact key civil rights and constituencies in our country. Our webinar series covers the topics of the Affordable Care Act, LGBTQ rights and services, women and girls, affordable housing and homelessness. And at the end of this webinar, we'll have a little more information on how to link to a previously recorded webinar on the ACA and some information on upcoming webinars. Now, just a little bit more about today's topic. The election results have left many LGBTQ people and their allies wondering what lies ahead for LGBTQ rights and services for LGBTQ people. While marriage equality appears safe for now, Obama administration policies such as directing schools to allow students to use restrooms consistent with their gender identity and prohibiting federal contractors from discriminating based on sexual orientation or gender identity are at great risk. Progress on transgender equality in particular is in danger. In today's webinar, our speaker, David Lloyd, will discuss what we can expect from an incoming Trump administration and the Republican-controlled Congress on a range of issues affecting LGBTQ youth and adults. And now, let me introduce our speaker. David Lloyd is a public policy expert and nonprofit consultant with more than a decade of experience in federal and state policy. At the federal level, David was a senior advisor to U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow from Michigan with deep expertise on tax and international trade issues. David also covered a variety of other issues during his time in the Senate, ranging from housing and health care to transportation and civil rights. At the state level, David worked as a senior policy analyst at Voices for Illinois Children, where he analyzed the finances of programs that serve children and youth. Later, David served as the organization's vice president and director of the Fiscal Policy Center. So David, I want to welcome you to this webinar today, and we're really looking forward in some respects to what you have to share with us. Thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you, Jean, and appreciate the introduction. And this series of webinars, I think, is really important, and particularly today's topic on LGBT adults and youth is kind of near and dear to my heart. So let's get started and kind of go through what some of the policy implications are under the new Trump presidency. And also the Republican-controlled Congress, because they're also critical players as well. So, just want to quickly go over, what we'll cover today. Many of the recent gains are in danger in LGBTQ rights, and we'll quickly go over what those gains have been, and then we'll look at what the different levers of change, what are the federal levers for change in the federal government, and that has implications for how easily progress can be reversed, and what the mechanisms by which changes might occur. And that, of course, includes Congress, the executive branch, and the judiciary, the federal courts. And then we'll take a closer look across a a range of different issues and what the implications might be for LGBTQ people. We'll look at marriage and families, healthcare, education, employment protections, military service, and several other federal policies as well. And then I'll also talk a little bit about civil rights generally and kind of the culture of fear that currently exists. And then towards the end, I'll try to point you towards selected resources where you can get more information. I do want to say from the outset, there will be issues that we won't have time to cover today, but certainly don't mean to minimize those areas. So why don't we go into looking at what some of the progress has been, and there really has been a very dramatic shift in public opinion on LGBTQ issues over the past 2 decades, and this has been particularly true on sexual orientation. And that change in public opinion has really enabled important policy advances. So this chart from Gallup shows that just 2 decades ago in the mid-90s, more than 2 out of 3 Americans polled said they were against recognition of same-sex marriages. By just last year, that had nearly flipped, with more than 6 in 10 respondents saying they favored recognition of same-sex couples being able to be married. And so that these changes in public opinion have been very, very important to the policy changes that have occurred. And this next slide, the pie chart simply shows support for both same-sex marriage, but also non-discrimination laws that protect LGBT people. And this was in June of 2015. More than 70% of Americans who were surveyed favored non-discrimination laws against LGBT people. And perhaps ironically, more than 75% of Americans wrongly believe that such federal laws already exist protecting LGBT people from employment discrimination. And even among white evangelical Protestants, which are often considered not to be as favorable for LGBT rights, nearly 60% favor these non-discrimination laws. I do want to point out, though, and this is important, that much of the progress that we have seen has been strongest in people's views on sexual orientation, and that public opinion regarding transgender rights is still much less firm, and there's a lot of work to do in terms of educating people and making sure that we push transgender equality. So this next slide simply shows, at the federal level, some of the progress that has been made in LGBTQ rights over the past 2 decades. You'll see, going back to 1996, the Supreme Court, in a landmark decision, struck down a Colorado ballot initiative that singled out LGBTQ people, and that was really a landmark decision at the time, Romer v. Evans. Of course, in 2003, the Supreme Court ruled in Lawrence v. Texas that sodomy laws were unconstitutional. And then really beginning around the start of Obama's first term, we saw tremendous progress start to be made. The HIV entry ban was lifted in 2009. There was Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal in 2010. Obama refused to defend the Defense of Marriage Act in court in 2011, which was followed by a string of decisions relating to marriage equality, and ultimately marriage equality became the law of the land in 2015 with Obergefell versus Hedges. And then there were other other areas of progress as well. In 2014, Obama issued an executive order prohibiting discrimination of LGBTQ people in the federal government as well as among federal contractors. And recently, just last year, the Department of Education issued guidance that said that the public schools had to allow transgender students to use restrooms and locker rooms that matched their gender identity, which was a very important step. And even last year, the military took steps to allow transgender service members to serve openly in the military. Again, long overdue. And then finally, over the last few years, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has issued guidance and basically interpreted Title VII of the Civil Rights Act to say that sexual orientation and gender identity are prohibited discrimination under Title VII. That is actually still being kind of tested in the courts about whether that will become essentially the law of the land. So, looking at the three branches of government, where the progress has come really helps determine how easy it is to move backwards. In terms of the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary, the pro-LGBTQ precedents that have occurred recently will be hard to overturn for several reasons, and this includes marriage equality. One is that there's the opening of the Supreme Court after the death of Antonin Scalia, who was widely regarded as not at all friendly to LGBTQ rights. A new justice wouldn't alter the dynamic of a majority in supporting LGBT rights at the Supreme Court. Now, there could be additional openings at the Supreme Court, and that is a longer-term danger. But still, the Supreme Court is generally very hesitant to just overturn recent precedent because there are kind of legitimacy issues that the court often is very careful about. In terms of the executive branch action, Obama's pro-LGBTQ executive orders relating to federal contractors, for instance, and not allowing them to discriminate are easy to undo and modify. They occurred with the stroke of a pen, and essentially they can be undone with the stroke of the pen under the new administration. And President-elect Trump can also change interpretations under Title VII and Title IX, and we'll cover that in a little bit more detail in several minutes because these are important areas. And there are also regulations that have been put in place through the federal regulatory process. Many of those can be undone, but it's harder. There are complex rules about how those have to be done, and there have to be justifications for those to occur, and those can be challenged in court if those justifications aren't in process aren't followed. And then many of these executive actions are often not that high profile in the general public, and so there is a danger that they can kind of fly under the public radar. And one of the things that I will encourage everyone later is to make sure that any anti-LGBT actions don't fly under the radar. And then last, looking at Congress, non-budget legislation needs to get past the Senate filibuster, which requires 60 votes in the Senate. That is very important because the Democrats control many more seats than the 40 necessary to mount a filibuster. However, as many of you have likely heard, there is something called budget reconciliation, which is not subject to a filibuster in the Senate and only needs 50 votes. And this is what puts the Affordable Care Act, Medicaid, and SNAP, and other what are called mandatory programs really at great risk in the coming weeks and months. And there also in Congress, there is a movement to push quote-unquote exemptions that essentially allow individuals to discriminate against LGBTQ people and many heterosexual people, for that matter, based on religious or moral beliefs. And so that is something that we need to watch carefully. But underlying all of this, I view public opinion and accountability as extremely important to both stopping anti-LGBTQ actions and holding our elected officials accountable, if these do occur. So let's dive right into the issues. This chart that I showed earlier regarding marriage equality, shows the dramatic change. As I just mentioned, the Supreme Court has now ruled that marriage is a fundamental constitutional right for same-sex couples. And the Trump administration can't undo this. Even if an anti-LGBTQ Supreme Court justice is confirmed, that won't change the current majority for marriage equality. And even if one of the liberal justices leaves the court would likely be very hesitant to reverse this precedent, particularly given the public's views of supporting marriage equality. Now, in terms of family law, much of this is our state-level issues that are subject to state laws. In many respects, those won't be affected by the Trump administration. Now, with marriage equality, same-sex married couples now have the ability to adopt in all 50 states, which is an important improvement. Now, marriage opponents, have shifted tact a bit. They have been mounting, these exemption, campaigns to allow exemptions based on more religious objections to same-sex marriage. And Republicans have vowed to push what they're calling the First Amendment Defense Act, and I put that in quotes for a reason. And if passed, President-elect Trump has vowed to sign. Now, opponents of this legislation and LGBTQ rights groups, I think rightly say that this would allow anyone, including government employees and healthcare professionals, to refuse to serve LGBTQ people. Now, this legislation may well be unconstitutional, and it does seem unlikely that it could overcome a Senate filibuster, although it may well pass the House. Importantly, at the state level, state versions of the First Amendment Defense Act continue to be pushed, and so that is important to watch out for in many states, particularly where where conservatives have many of the levers of government. Now, looking at LGBTQ health and the Affordable Care Act, this is kind of the most immediate crisis generally in the country, I would argue, but also for LGBTQ people. The ACA has critical protections for LGBTQ people, and such as requiring coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. So that's important for anyone with a chronic condition, including those with HIV and hepatitis C, for example. There also are requirements for coverage of prescription drugs, including expensive antiretrovirals to fight HIV. The ACA also has, also includes coverage protections for transgender individuals and mandates for equal access to healthcare facilities, which are important steps forward. Now, if the ACA is repealed or partially repealed through the budget reconciliation process, the Urban Institute estimates that 30 million people could lose coverage by 2019, and about 1.2 million of these people would be in Illinois. And even though the entire ACA cannot be repealed through the budget reconciliation process, because budget reconciliation essentially only applies to items, to legislation parts of legislation that affects the budget. Even though portions of the ACA cannot be repealed under this process, many of these will become meaningless without all the other components of the ACA. For example, having requirements for coverage of people with pre-existing conditions is meaningless if the individual non-group insurance market collapses, which will almost certainly happen if the ACA is repealed in the manner that is currently being talked about. So also in LGBTQ health, the potential block granting of Medicaid is a big danger. So Medicaid is an entitlement program where if you are eligible, you receive benefits. Block granting of Medicaid would essentially give states a set amount of money and say, essentially cover the population in your states, but you're free to cut eligibility and limit benefits in order to kind of not spend any more than you're given. And over time, block grants tend not to grow with rising healthcare costs and changes in need. So during the next recession, for example, when need would inevitably grow for health insurance, coverage under Medicaid, the block grant likely wouldn't grow as well. And one of the things that we have seen just last year was the House Budget Chairman Tom Price, who is now the nominee to be Department of Health and Human Services nominee. Okay. I'm getting a little feedback, but in any case, so Tom Price's plan to block grant Medicaid last year, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, estimated that by 2026, Medicaid spending by 1/3. And
David, can you hold on one second? If somebody's talking, could you please mute your line? Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. And so that a 1/3 cut to Medicaid would be devastating for the program and put the risk on states and really harm state budgets overall and lead to less coverage. And LGBTQ health advocates fear that many states would respond to block granting of Medicaid by limiting the number of prescriptions that might be covered, which harms individuals with complex chronic condition like HIV. And also, we've had experience with this in the past. The state AIDS drug assistance programs have been subject to repeated cuts at the state level, which has left waiting lists, and people fear that might similar dynamics might occur with Medicaid. So other impacts on LGBTQ health, that are possible from the election. One happened immediately after the election. The Department of Veterans Affairs tabled an expected decision to cover gender affirmation surgery, and this was widely seen as due to the election results. And also, there's a big danger for LGBTQ health programs, programs related to LGBTQ health, that budget cuts may harm them. And so while there's broad support for things like the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program and the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which is known as PEPFAR, these areas may not escape cuts. And this is because both President-elect Trump and Republicans in Congress have said they want to reallocate defense cuts that are currently mandated under what's called sequestration to non-defense programs. And President-elect Trump has also said he wants to cut non-defense discretionary spending by 1% each year over 10 years. It might not sound like much, but that is very, very significant. And this would put severe pressure on all non-defense discretionary programs. And the chart at left, again, from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, shows the effect of what those cuts would represent. And you would see really significant cuts to the non-defense discretionary portion of the budget. So let's now turn to education and LGBTQ youth. And first of all, we'll look at Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. You likely heard of Title IX because it guarantees access to programs based on sex and prohibits discrimination. The Obama administration has held that gender identity is covered under Title IX based on the prohibition of discrimination based on sex. And so this is where the Obama administration's guidance to allow transgender students to use restrooms and locker rooms that correspond with their gender identity comes from. Now, the Supreme Court is actually set to hear a case relatively soon brought by a student who felt he was denied access to the restroom that corresponds with his gender identity. And the Federal Appeals Court gives deference to the executive branch and in this case, the Education Department's Office of Civil Rights, that Title IX protects a student. If President Trump withdraws this guidance, this could well impact this and other pending court cases and affect transgender students' rights. There's also the danger that President Trump could be less aggressive in defending the rights of LGBTQ students in education settings. The Obama administration has been very aggressive at filing civil rights complaints and conducting investigations on behalf of LGBTQ students. I also quickly want to mention concerns about quote-unquote conversion therapy. Vice President-elect Trump and other advisors to Trump Vice President-elect Pence and other Trump advisors have expressed past support for quote-unquote conversion therapy, and actually the Republican Party included language in its platform that kind of winks in support of conversion therapy this year. So there is worry that this will be pushed for LGBT youth to essentially have the federal government give permission for this to be used. And then finally on education, anti-bullying and harassment. The Obama administration has told schools that they have obligations to protect LGBTQ students from sex-based harassment. We certainly hope that the Trump administration will continue this, but it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility that the Trump administration will not be as aggressive on bullying issues. So looking at employment protections, and I mentioned that there is no federal laws protecting LGBTQ people from employment discrimination, but under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII prohibits employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, or national origin. And it also established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, to enforce this. Now, under President Obama, the EEOC interpreted Title VII to say that prohibitions of discrimination based on sex include both gender identity and sexual orientation. That essentially discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity are inseparable from sex discrimination. And this is actually being tested in the courts right now. And under President Trump, the EEOC could essentially wipe out these guidelines and adversely affect ongoing court cases. Now, President Obama, as I mentioned earlier, also issued an executive order prohibiting the federal government and federal contractors from discriminating based on sexual orientation and gender identity. It's widely believed that Trump will rescind this executive order, which will take an important protection away from LGBTQ people. And given the size of federal government employment and federal contractors, this affects a lot of people. Now, LGBTQ people in the military, you may remember that in 2009, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, but essentially that repeal, it just took away the requirement that the military have the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy in place. It didn't tell the military what it had to do with regards to open service of LGB service members. And it is conceivable that President Trump could roll back open service of service members based on their sexual orientation, although there hasn't really been any indication that the Trump administration is considering this, and there's likely would be deep resistance in the military to go backwards, and also would go against public opinion. But it is a possibility. Now, people are more worried about military service for transgender service members. The military took steps last year to allow transgender service members to serve openly and also access needed health care. President Trump could take steps to undo these moves by putting in place, back in place the regulations that prohibited open service. And this could affect an estimated nearly 13,000 service members. So, particularly for transgender people, changing gender markers on ID documents are very important. And the chart at the right, which is from the 2015 U.S. Transgender Survey Report, shows the difficulty that many transgender people have had in both updating their names on ID documents as well as updating their gender. Now, the Obama administration has made it much easier to both change name and gender markers on federal ID documents, such as passports. It's unclear what the Trump administration will do regarding the ability to change gender markers. There have been reports that more transgender people have been seeking to change the gender markers on federal ID documents. But this is a very important issue. And state IDs, of course, are governed by a myriad of state laws, which really are unaffected by the federal transition of power. So a few other federal policy areas to consider. One is housing. In 2012, Obama issued an equal access rule to ensure that HUD allowed access to all of its programs based regardless of people's sexual orientation or gender identity. This was a very important step. It's unclear whether the Trump administration will seek to go backwards, on the equal access rule. It would have to go through the federal rulemaking process, which makes it slightly more difficult to change. And it's also important to recognize that 40% of all homeless youth are LGBTQ, and that housing programs and ensuring access to shelters, regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, is a very important issue. Also, under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau made clear last September that it believes that, again, prohibitions of sex discrimination applies to both gender identity and sexual orientation. And you'll see a clear theme in kind of what the Obama administration has held with regard to, wherever there are prohibitions based on discrimination based on sex, that the Obama administration believes that that includes gender identity and sexual orientation. Now, the Trump administration, once again, can change this interpretation, and that's particularly important because these issues are making their way through the courts about whether essentially the Obama administration has the correct legal interpretation that these laws should encompass gender identity and sexual orientation. Now, with regard to immigration and kind of foreign affairs, with any LGBT immigrants are potentially at risk, like all immigrants, given what Trump has said he wants to do with regard to especially unauthorized immigrants in the United States. And this also, of course, affects binational LGBTQ couples, particularly where one member of the couple does not have status to be in the United States. It's also unclear with regard to LGBT asylum cases, whether those will be affected. There has been kind of some speculation that the Trump administration could essentially increase the burden of proof that people applying for asylum have to show in order to get asylum if they're doing it based on sexual orientation or gender identity. That many people who have been in countries that are oppressive of sexual orientation, minorities of sexual orientation and transgender people are frankly in the closet. And if you require them to show proof if they have been discriminated against and persecuted, then that's a higher bar if they've been in the closet because they've feared such persecution. And also, with regard to foreign affairs, Obama has really been a leader in directing U.S. agencies to promote and protect the human rights of LGBTQ people abroad, and he's appointed representatives and envoys overseas to LGBTQ communities. And President Trump could undo this, and he could simply direct ambassadors of foreign countries, for example, who are now allowed to participate in pride parades, that they could no longer do so. So it might be that the U.S. Retrenches a bit in its advocacy on behalf of human rights for LGBTQ persons abroad. So finally, wanted to look at civil rights broadly in the culture of fear, and obviously LGBTQ people have historically not had their civil rights protected, and I think without question Obama has been one of the most, likely the most pro-LGBTQ presidents in history, and he has been particularly aggressive at trying to expand transgender civil rights. And of course, transgender individuals are particularly at risk and need aggressive protection of their civil rights. And unfortunately, the rhetoric of throughout the campaign, particularly from Trump, has left many LGBTQ people with a great deal of fear about how he will use the very substantial powers of the presidency. And the two charts below, simply, again, they're from the U.S. Transgender Survey Report, simply show the extent to which transgender individuals have been singled out and have not had their civil rights protected. On the left, shows percentages of transgender people who believe who experienced certain discrimination or had certain experiences in primary and secondary education, and the percentages are really they're it's really incredible the percentage of transgender people who have experienced violence, who have experienced bullying, and really the using the power of the presidency and the power of, for example, the Justice Department is really important to protecting LGBTQ people's rights. And the right simply shows where transgender people have been denied access to equal treatment in public accommodations. And again, it's pretty pervasive in people who have experienced, have been denied equal treatment in public accommodations. So, looking at what advocacy suggestions, particularly for LGBTQ people and rights, at this moment and in the Trump administration. Right now, with the Affordable Care Act, the time is now that we have to make clear that repealing the Affordable Care Act, particularly without any alternative, is simply unacceptable. And the next several weeks will likely determine the extent to which the Affordable Care Act survives. And particularly in the Senate, there are a number of Senate Republicans who are expressing heartburn about repealing the Affordable Care Act. And if there are just a few Senate Republicans who would vote against doing so, that could save the Affordable Care Act overall, or at least important parts of the Affordable Care Act. I'd also encourage you, to document stories and speak out. The press and public need to be allies in helping to protect LGBTQ people and raising the political cost for taking actions that harm LGBTQ people. I'd also urge you to connect the dots. Where there are actions that harm LGBTQ people, those should be called out, and the people responsible and institutions responsible, should be held accountable. And you can do this if you're at a nonprofit in a 501c3 compliant way. And then I'd also urge you, again, the stories are very important, and it's also very important to confront anti-LGBTQ representatives. That it's very important to make opponents of LGBTQ rights and kind of the fence setters uncomfortable, to raise the stakes. And then finally, collaborate and organize. This is now more important than ever, to recognize kind of the intersectionality between both LGBTQ rights and economic rights and immigrant rights, and really to work together to support all the communities that need support in what could be potentially a very difficult time if we don't work together. And so here are some selected resources. I'll lead this up just very briefly. You will have access to this presentation so that you can link to get to these suggested resources later on. And then finally, happy to take questions, but also wanted to remind you of 2 upcoming webinars next week on women and girls, and then at the same time, and then 2 weeks from now on affordable housing and homelessness. And you can also view the previous webinar that was done in December on the Affordable Care Act at the link here. But yes, happy to answer any questions, and thank you very much for your time.
So Nancy, let's make sure everybody's unmuted and find out if anybody has any questions. Why don't you just go ahead and ask your question. You can talk directly to David. Or maybe comments. Does anybody have any comments or anything you would add to the presentation? David, I don't know if you've been listening to any of the hearings this week on the nominees, but I was just kind of curious if you've heard anything in terms of people's responses from Jeff Sessions or anyone else that would, give you any indication that things are moving in a more positive direction or more negative direction.
Well, certainly I saw some of Senator Sessions, who is the Attorney General nominee. I saw some of his his hearing yesterday, and certainly he, with regard to many issues, I think wanted to portray himself as pretty moderate and mainstream, and which I think was that's a good thing. I think there are a lot of people who, though, are still very worried, because the Department of Justice has a lot of power about how to prioritize enforcement of civil rights, and ultimately whether it will bring cases and actions to protect people's civil rights. So certainly that is an important position. There's still additional hearings to occur for the nominees, and I think we'll be looking closely at what those what the nominees say. I know that, for example, for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, nominee Ben Carson is coming up, and I actually just saw this morning all the questions that Senator Warren submitted to him, and several of them were about the equal access rule and LGBTQ access to housing programs, and also making sure that we address LGBTQ homeless youth. And so it'll be very interesting to see how he responds to those questions.
Hi, David. This is Nayong from Korean American Resource and Culture Center. I couldn't join the Affordable Care Act webinar. You might talk about it a little more detailed. So if the reconciliation bill passed, I I heard that in Illinois there is a killing statute to kill the Medicaid immediately in Illinois. So could you a little bit explain more what will happen in Illinois in states? And do you know among 1.2 million who were affected by ACA repealing, how many people are LGBTQ?
Sure. With regard to the first question, when Illinois was passing Medicaid expansion, there was worry that what if the federal reimbursement drops below kind of the 90% level, which is where where the federal reimbursement for the Medicaid expansion ends up. What will happen if if reimbursement drops below that? Essentially, at the time, in order to address that concern, Illinois put in place a provision that said if reimbursement drops below 90%, for the expansion population, that essentially the Medicaid expansion would be undone. And I think no one actually thought that that might ever occur. So it was kind of seen as something to put in place, but really was kind of not very meaningful. Now, if the federal government undoes Medicaid expansion, that would mean that the federal government wouldn't contribute any money. And my understanding is that you're correct that essentially the population that Medicaid was expanded to in Illinois would lose access to Medicaid. Now, with regard to your question about the 1.2 million people in Illinois, the estimate of how many people might lose insurance if under repeal of large portions of the Affordable Care Act, I actually don't have a good estimate for the number that are LGBTQ people. Certainly, I think there would be a very sizable percentage who are LGBTQ would lose their health insurance. But I don't have a specific estimate on that.
Other questions? All right. Well, not hearing any other comments. I guess I'm just curious from other callers if you are tracking these issues already, if these are, if you're part of collaborations that are going to be looking at these LGBTQ issues that David's been talking about here. Can anybody comment on efforts that are underway to monitor and to basically try to preserve these policies that are in place?
Well, this is Greg Storms at the Center in Halstead, the brand new director of the Youth Services Project program. We are definitely looking at these issues as we go along. I can't talk about it in too much detail because I literally just started this position last Thursday. So I'm still learning as I go along. But previously, I did my doctorate in anthropology and LGBTQ studies, and that I've been personally working on these sorts of issues in my own research, and I'm bringing that to the Center in Halstead. So I can say at least that we have been working on those issues here for a very long time, and definitely going to amp that up. There is obviously a great bit of concern since we cater to LGBTQ clients primarily. We have been concerned about the transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration quite a bit, and we're keeping our eyes open and everything.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, and welcome, Greg. It's nice to meet you.
You too.
All right. Any other questions or comments from anyone? All right. Well, I guess we'll close it there then. I just want to thank everybody for being on this webinar today, and I want to thank David for his time preparing for this webinar today, and encourage you to sign up for future webinars on this topic, and let you know that if you would like more information about Mission+Strategy Consulting, please visit our website. And with that, I'll close out this webinar and just encourage everybody to have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.